Resuming debate, the honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising today to contribute to the debate on Bill C-24. And I'm always interested when governments present bills, Mr. Speaker, in kind of like what it says about what I think you kind of have to understand the motivation of a bill in order to really judge its worth, Mr. Speaker. So part of my comments today are going to be about what I think the motivation for this bill really is. And hopefully, in assessing that, we'll be able to get a better sense of the worth of the bill. The government would have us believe that there's an important principle of equality at stake in this bill. But in fact, the bill fails to manifest any greater equality between ministers or between men and women in cabinet, for that matter, Mr. Speaker, than the existing legislative regime. And it entrenches an important regional inequality created by the new Liberal government. In the press release issued by the government when they introduced the bill, they said that this legislation is meant to show, and I quote, that the Government of Canada is committed to creating a one-tier ministry, and we've heard that language again today in the House, Mr. Speaker, that recognizes the equality of all cabinet ministers, end quote. Now, that statement strikes me as a little strange, Mr. Speaker. I wonder how many governments regularly issue statements affirming that they do in fact value the opinion of the people that they put around the cabinet table. I can't imagine there's that many, Mr. Speaker. I would think that that goes without saying, that if a Prime Minister puts people at the cabinet table, that they do in fact value the opinion of that member of the cabinet. So I found it passing strange that the government felt the need to let Canadians know that they do actually take cabinet members seriously. But you know, in the post-2015 world, I suppose anything really is possible, Mr. Speaker. And in addition to being odd, the statement about a one-tier ministry is also vague. It's not exactly clear in what sense the legislation will make all cabinet ministers equal. For instance, Mr. Speaker, there's a number of ways in which cabinet ministers might be found to be equal or unequal. For instance, they might be equal or unequal as the case may be with respect to pay, experience, title, resources, competence, and so on, Mr. Speaker. Some of these things obviously are not fixable by way of legislation, and some are, and it's clear to me that the bill obviously has to deal with those equalities or inequalities that could be established by legislation. So we still have to figure out what exactly is the relevant sense of equality that the government is trying to zero in on here. The kinds of inequality between ministers that can be addressed through legislation are differences in resources, in pay, in level of responsibility, and in title. And I want to come to those in a little bit, but first I want to give some of the context for the bill as I see it and briefly explain the changes contained in the bill. The origin of the bill goes back to a year ago today, Mr. Speaker. After the election, the Prime Minister set about building his cabinet, having committed in the Liberal platform to, quote, include an equal number of women and men in our cabinet, end quote. When he announced the new cabinet, observers quickly noticed that, excluding himself, there were 15 male ministers, 10 female ministers, and 5 female ministers of state to assist other ministers. Ministers of state aren't department heads, and before the election received less pay than ministers. This meant that 5 of the female cabinet members were to be paid less and enjoy less responsibility than their male colleagues. Despite having almost but not quite achieved his promise of including an equal number of men and women in cabinet, because for the benefit of the Prime Minister and other members who may wonder, I'll state, simple math today is my theme apparently, Mr. Speaker, that 16 is not equal to 15. Despite that, he had clearly not achieved gender equality in the cabinet. I think it's fair to say that this was an embarrassment for the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. If he didn't feel embarrassed, I think he probably should have. It was an embarrassment because the Prime Minister showed a lack of competence in simple math, as I said before, failing to recognize that 16 men is not the same as 15 women and that doesn't balance, Mr. Speaker. But it was also an embarrassment because the Prime Minister, who went out of his way to promote himself as a feminist, filled all his junior cabinet posts with women, thereby creating a gender gap in both pay and responsibility inside his cabinet. Now, either that's embarrassing because it exposes a rather superficial feminism and shows that the Prime Minister is willing to do just enough to get credit for being a feminist and no more, or it's embarrassing because it shows a complete lack of comprehension of the different cabinet posts that were available to him and the tools that were available to him to build a cabinet, because he clearly didn't understand, if he was sincere in his feminist intention, the difference between what a minister of state was and what a minister was. It may in fact be a bit of both, Mr. Speaker. That would be even more embarrassing, I think. And the bill, as it stands, seems to suggest that it is actually a little bit of both. And I'll get into why. Consider, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister could have avoided this embarrassment by simply adding or eliminating one Minister of State and ensuring that those positions were distributed equally between men and women. That would have solved the gender difference in Cabinet. He could also have avoided the embarrassment if he knew his options a little better, Mr. Speaker, than he apparently did, or does, because this bill, I think, adds to confusion about what the options are for building a Cabinet. He could have established, under the authority of the existing Ministries and Ministers of State Act, Ministries of State for the 5 Ministers of State. These could have functioned essentially as mini departments resourced by reallocating staff and funds from other departments. A Minister of State responsible for a Ministry of State would be the head of that Ministry of State and not assigned to assist another minister. Furthermore, under existing legislation, Ministers of State responsible for a Ministry of State are already mandated to receive the same pay as ministers who are department heads, Mr. Speaker. So that's another way that the Prime Minister could have avoided both the pay gap and alleviated that gap in responsibility between those positions. For those keeping score now, in terms of Cabinet positions, I've mentioned 3. There's ministers, Ministers of State for a Ministry of State, and Ministers of State to assist. This bill purports to create a further type of Cabinet Minister, or Cabinet member, I should say. What are currently referred to in legislation simply as ministers, if C-24 passes, would now be referred to as ministers for a department. And then a new type of minister would be created called ministers for whom a department is designated. And those ministers that are currently ministers of state, the idea, I think the government has clearly expressed their intent, would be converted to this new kind of minister, ministers for whom a department is designated. Bill C-24 allows that, quote, ministers for a department may delegate to a minister in respect of whom that department is designated any of the appropriate minister's powers, duties, or functions. And furthermore, that a minister in respect of whom a department is designated may use the services and facilities of that department. Now that might sound familiar, Mr. Speaker, because I know all members are very familiar with the Ministries and Ministers of State Act, and they would have noticed, I'm sure, that it sounds a lot like Section 11 of the Ministries and Ministers of State Act that states that a Minister of State to assist, quote, shall exercise or perform such of the powers, duties, or functions of any minister or ministers having responsibilities for any department or other portion of the federal public administration as may be assigned or transferred to him. And furthermore, that a Minister of State to assist shall make use of the services and facilities of the department or portion of the federal public administration concerned. The language is very similar because the positions at the end of the day are very similar. They enjoy a similar level of responsibility, and they're resourced in pretty much exactly the same way, Mr. Speaker. It's a little bit, when you read it, I mean, it's a little bit like the first time you see an infomercial for a Snuggie, and they're trying to say that here's this blanket and with a lot of great conceptual innovation and new features, and you're sitting there going, isn't that just a backwards bathrobe? Really? Made of fleece? And there's this awkward tension where you think, what? No, this is not really a new thing. It's just a repackaged old thing, and I've already got one, so I don't need to buy a new one, Mr. Speaker. There's no practical difference between Ministers of State to assist and ministers for whom a department is designated. If the government insists on having a new name for the same old thing, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to submit a different one. I think ministers formerly known as Ministers of State would be a much catchier and probably more to the point title for these new ministers, Mr. Speaker. So Bill C-24 is the government, perhaps there'll be an amendment of committee to that effect, Mr. Speaker. So Bill C-24 is the government's response to the Prime Minister's awkward cabinet launch last fall where he pretty much fell flat on his face, but it's not clear how the bill really fixes anything. So we know it's a response to that. We know that's where it comes from. But then the question is, so does it fix any of that? Does it actually do the work that the government has identified as needed doing? If the idea is simply to close the gender wage gap needlessly created by the Prime Minister, the bill is unnecessary. First of all, the Prime Minister didn't have to choose to appoint only women to minister of state positions. The gap could be closed by making more women full ministers and some men ministers of state. That would be fine, Mr. Speaker. Second, existing legislation allows them to pay ministers of state the same as ministers. And in fact, the government's been doing that for years, so the legislation isn't required to do that. And third, as I mentioned earlier, the Prime Minister could have created ministries of state out of the resources of existing departments and given those ministers of state more authority and responsibility within the government, and the current legislation would have required that the government pay them the same as a minister. Not just choose, but require them to do so. If the idea was to close of this bill is to close the gender responsibility gap needlessly created by the Prime Minister when he appointed only women to positions of Minister of State, then the bill is also unnecessary. This too could be solved simply by making more women full ministers and some men ministers of state, or by establishing ministries of state. If the idea is to eliminate the difference in administrative responsibility between ministers and in that sense make them equal, then the bill fails to do that too. There will continue to be a difference between ministers for departments on the one hand and ministers of state to assist, ministers for whom a department is designated, ministers formerly known as ministers of state, or whatever the government ultimately chooses to call them. There's still going to be a real difference of administrative responsibility between those positions. They'll not be equal in that sense. So the bill, if that's the point, is a failure. We're trying to keep in mind, Mr. Speaker, what I'm trying to do is identify the relevant sense of equal in which this bill makes them equal. And as you can see, I've given it a lot of thought, and I haven't been able to come up with anything, Mr. Speaker, and I don't think it's because it's there and I can't find it. I think it's because the conclusion of my study of the bill shows that it isn't there. So moreover, I want to say there's nothing wrong with having people at the cabinet table who have different levels of administrative responsibility. I mean, when the Prime Minister fell flat on his face in his cabinet unveiling because he didn't manage to create gender equality in the cabinet, people weren't outraged at the fact that there were ministers of state and ministers. No one said, I can't believe the ministers aren't equal. They said, I can't believe that the Prime Minister who calls himself a feminist is not treating female members of the cabinet equally because he's giving them junior roles in cabinet instead of senior roles in cabinet. That was the issue. The issue wasn't that there were legitimate differences in administrative responsibility and corresponding titles. So again, it's not clear what real problem this is trying to solve. The fact that ministers of state don't have a department or are called ministers of state instead of minister shouldn't detract from their contribution to discussions about war and peace or budgets or other policy issues around the cabinet table. They're all entitled to sit there, and if other cabinet ministers don't take them seriously because of their difference in simple title, that's not a legislative problem, that's a problem in organizational culture, and this bill isn't going to fix that either. That would require real leadership from the Prime Minister. Somewhere deep down, I think the government actually knows this, Mr. Speaker, and that's why they're not repealing the Ministries and Ministers of State Act. They're keeping that option open. In fact, in the speech of the member for Winnipeg North who introduced the bill, he actually said, he made a point of pointing out that they're not repealing that act. They're keeping the option of ministers of state around. There's an awkward tension in the principle that they're stating there, Mr. Speaker, because on the one hand, they are saying that there's something wrong with having ministers of state, because that creates an inequality in cabinet. Now, if in the future of this ministry, the government wants to appoint ministers of state, I think Canadians should rightly say that by their own standards, they've now decided to have inferior cabinet ministers and superior cabinet ministers. Now, I don't think that that would be right, because I think there is a role for legitimate differences in administrative responsibility, but the government is arguing against that, and yet not repealing the act, which I find strange, Mr. Speaker. I mean, it helps right now to make a grand show of not having ministers of state because what's driving the bill is this need to make up for and reduce the sense of shame and embarrassment by the Prime Minister for having failed to do something that he said he really wanted to do, which was to bring gender equality to cabinet. State is not compatible with having a one-tier ministry, and having a one-tier ministry is an important matter of principle for the Liberals. I don't see why they wouldn't just repeal the Ministries and Ministers of State Act. Although, for the record, Mr. Speaker, I just want to say I think that would be a terrible idea. It's just a logical consequence of the arguments that they've been advancing on Bill C-24. Interestingly, they're locking in another choice that they made, the choice not to have standalone ministers for regional economic development. So this is another sense of equality we might talk about, regional equality. Now here, they're actually locking in a bad decision that goes hand in hand with the decision they made to centralize the management of the various regional economic development agencies in one minister, Mr. Speaker. And what that means is that only one region of the country actually gets a minister from the region that understands the needs of the region because he or she lives there, in this case it's a he, lives there and understand and represents that area. All the other regions don't get that benefit and so are not being treated equally, Mr. Speaker. And it may be, so, you know, granted, it's the government's prerogative to experiment with new ways of doing this. I think they've made a poor decision. I think this kind of centralizing of decision-making for agencies that have a deliberately regional mandate does not make sense and ultimately is not helpful. But the government wants to try something new. They're doing that. I think they'll find that it doesn't work. Why close the door behind them and make it harder to go back to a model that I think works better, which is actually having ministers from the regions being in charge of the local regional development agencies. And particularly in tough economic times, the government may find in time that it's worth making it the full-time job of a cabinet minister to do that. And that's what they're taking away in doing this, Mr. Speaker. And I don't think that makes sense. So they're leaving their options open with sort of slush ministries or extra ministries that aren't really designated yet. They're leaving their options open by, even though saying that there's some matter of principle at stake in not having ministers of state, we're going to keep the act around just in case we want to appoint them anyway. And on the thing that they should be keeping their options open on, because they've embarked on a centralizing experiment when it comes to regional economic development, they're deciding instead to tie their hands. That doesn't make sense to me, Mr. Speaker. I think they've got their priorities backwards. I think, for instance, people in Elmwood Transcona would prefer to have a minister from Western Canada who knows and understands Western Canada's economy, making the detailed decisions about how the government's going to go about encouraging Western economic diversification. And I believe people in other parts of the country feel the same way about their own region. The government should leave itself more and not less options when it comes to how it's going to manage regional economic development. They're creating 3 as yet unspecified ministries in the name of flexibility, so why not retain the flexibility they already have with respect to regional economic development? Now, where does this leave us, Mr. Speaker? We've got a bill that it seems to me was drafted by the minister's personal communications team with the full dearth of understanding of legislative and parliamentary process that implies. It's not a bill that's really about furthering any principle of equality, because for any of the government's goals for this bill with respect to equality, and I think I've gone through a pretty exhaustive list of different senses of equality that the government might mean, C-24 either fails or is completely unnecessary. This bill creates an expanded, more complicated set of cabinet building options for a prime minister that already didn't understand the options that were available to him, while tending to mask real differences in responsibility by maintaining the tradition of junior and senior cabinet posts. Let's be clear, that's what a minister for whom a department is designated is, while conferring the same title on each cabinet member. The Prime Minister wants to be lauded for bringing real gender equality to cabinet, but in order to do that, instead of taking, real action on that, Mr. Speaker, he's just glossing over the fact that his ministers, formerly known as ministers of state, really are just ministers of state with a better salary and a better title. It's no secret that where the Prime Minister is concerned, style trumps substance. But it's shocking to see that tendency drill down to the level where it's starting to interfere with a relatively straightforward administrative matter such as determining what act of parliament will authorize the payment of ministers of state. That's something else, Mr. Speaker. The end result is that we're forced to consider a bill that's a colossal waste of time. I know the Liberal government has been criticized for having a notoriously light legislative agenda, but the goal of those critics wasn't to encourage them to produce nonsense bills that don't change anything. The idea was that we might spur them on to introduce meaningful legislation that helps move the country forward. For instance, Mr. Speaker, if they want a quick short list off the top of my head, they could move to repeal Bill C-51. They could move to reinstate the Navigable Water Protection Act that was decimated in the last Parliament to protect Canadian water. They could reinstate the Fair Wages and Hours of Labour Act, and that's just to get us back to a baseline of where we were before the last 10 years of government. If they wanted to go further and begin improving on that baseline, they could bring forward legislation granting pay equity for Canadian women, which they've said they're going to wait till the end of 2018 to do. They could bring in a meaningful rail safety regime instead of continuing to rely on industry self-regulation. And the list goes on, Mr. Speaker. There are so many important issues facing the country crying out for government action, and we're stuck with a bill that's really just about easing the Prime Minister's sense of shame at having botched his own cabinet debut.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Newmarket, Aurora.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for Elmwood Transcona for his contribution today. And I found it a little bit humorous when he referred to the names of the new ministries as ministries formerly known as something else. And I found it quite rich coming from the party formerly known as the official opposition. And I found it even more rich when his friends next to him were laughing coming from the party formerly known as the government. So I appreciated the sense of irony and all of that. But I just want him maybe to explain to the House what he sees as unimportant and not to be a priority about la francophonie, about small businesses, about science, about the status of women, and about persons with disabilities. Why does he think those ministries are not important to Canadians?
The honourable member for Elmwood, Transcona.
Well, I thank the member from a party formerly known as the Third Party for his question, and would note that, this is just part of the fundamental dishonesty about the government's arguments on this bill, Mr. Speaker. It's not that people don't think it's important. This is such a rinky-dink notion, Mr. Speaker, that all of a sudden, after a whole Canadian history of having ministers of state in order to implement a portfolio, somehow, all of a sudden, because the Liberals got elected, oh, well, if a minister of state is put in charge of something, it's not important. It is still important. Ministers of state are important people in the government. No one's disputing that. The problem wasn't whether ministers of state are important or not. The problem wasn't whether ministers of state have a voice at the cabinet table or not. That's ridiculous. The problem was, out of 5 ministries of state, a prime minister who is a self-professed feminist decided to make all of those junior ministers women. That's the problem. So let's talk about the real problem instead of these ridiculous claims by the government about what's important and what's not.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Caribou Prince George.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I listened intently and want to thank our honourable colleague from Elmwood Transcona for his just brilliant speech. I thought it was very, very good, and any speech that gets in the word Snuggie in there and a comparison to a Snuggie is something else. Mr. Speaker, I come from Caribou Prince George, and in the early 2000s, our region and indeed the province of British Columbia was decimated by the pine beetle. Pine beetle infestation. And so at that time we had a government that had regional ministers there that were on the ground, that knew the issues. And as we look to diversify our economy, not only in my riding of Caribou Prince George, but also the province of British Columbia, we looked at how do we diversify our economy? What are some of the natural advantages that we have? There was investment in the Port of Prince Rupert. There was investment in the CN Intermodal facility. There was investment in the Prince George Airport Authority. There was investment in the Asia Pacific Gateway, but there was also investment in the honourable colleagues riding Winnipeg Centerport. And that connected Canada to the world. And the reason why that was done is that they had regional ministers on the ground that could speak to the validity and the value of that investment. And what this government has done, and my question to the honourable colleague through you, Mr. Speaker, is this is less about gender equality, this decision in this bill. It's more about centralized government. And as he had so aptly said about writing the Prime Minister's sense of shame and falling flat on his face, not only just on when he made his initial announcement, but the bungling of this last year. And again, through you, Mr. Speaker, I just wonder if the honourable colleague would like to comment on that, on those 2 points.
The honourable member from Elmwood, Transcona.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the member from Caribou Prince George, a former seatmate of mine. We used to have more occasions to discuss the issues of the day, so I'm glad to take up that habit once again, Mr. Speaker, and say that he's quite right. I mean, the idea that in a country as large as Canada, I mean, that you're going to have one minister on top of all the details and important things to know about the various regions, whose economies are quite different. They're based on different sectors in some case. They're based on different kinds of resources. They have different labor market challenges. That one minister is going to be on top of all of that, I just think is not believable. And And I can tell you that, yeah, I would like to be able to go to a minister that knows my region. It's the same reason why I think, you know, when we talk about electoral reform, for instance, 2 points. One, it's really important to Canadians to have someone represent their geographical area. And Canadians have said when we talk about that they want someone that represents their area because they believe that there's an importance between connection to an area and being able to represent that area well. So if a minister is going to be in charge of a regional economic development agency, then it stands to reason, I think, that for the same reasons, you would want one that comes from that region and represents that region in order to feel that sense of connection and have confidence that you don't have to have already told them everything about your region or gotten it in. You need to know that when they're in a room and decisions have to get made, that they already know this stuff so that they don't make a decision and then have to go back and reverse it because there's something they didn't know. That's important. The other thing that for me, and it's maybe odd for the member, but I'm thinking about this in terms of the feedback that we got on electoral reform. One of the important arguments for proportional representation is getting regional voices in national caucuses, right? And that's because we know that national caucuses, whether it's a government caucus or an opposition caucus, benefits from that kind of regional representation because members from those areas can bring a voice to that caucus that helps make better decisions that are more sensitive to rolling out government-wide decisions in particular regions, or having opposition parties that understand better the needs of particular regions and are able to hold the government to account for policies that don't necessarily make sense in a cookie-cutter way across all regions. So I think, you know, there's another area where we talk about the importance of regional representation. I think the arguments apply equally here.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Timiskaming-Nijet-Témiscouata-Libat. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Now, when I hear the Liberals talk about this issue, I have to think about when the cabinet was formed. Nobody was talking about anything but other than ministers and ministers of state. But now today, the Liberals are trying to tell us that they are undertaking a great progressive revolution. All ministers with important responsibilities will be on an equal footing. So it seems that they've been caught without having brought in real gender parity, and now they're trying to correct that. So I'm wondering if my colleague could tell me how a government can pretend to be progressive and yet make a mistake and try to correct it afterward.
The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yeah, you know, I mean, I think what's interesting about this, I've often said that one of the things that I find frustrating often about Liberals is that there's that their politics often seem to be informed by a desire simply to be in politics and to win as much as possible in politics and not to stand for any particular principle. The principle can change day to day. What's important is that they're there because they want the status and the title and the things that come from that. So, I mean, I talked about a lot of different senses of equality, Madam Speaker, that we might decipher in this bill. It turns out that if there is a sense of equality at stake, it's just the title. And what's in a name, Madam Speaker? Only a Liberal government could feel that they were really creating a revolution for women just by, well, first of all, it shouldn't be all women in Minister of State positions or ministers for whom a department is designated or ministries formerly known as Ministers of State. It shouldn't just be women there, but it's only a Liberal government could think that they were actually doing something of substance simply by changing the style. And that is a recurring problem.
So I'm sorry.